So 3, 2, 1, perfect. Okay, yep, awesome. So we're live, first time in 2021. So this should be good. It's my pleasure to welcome Claire today. So Claire from Integrated Resources, right? Claire, Director of Integrated Resources, I believe.
Absolutely.
So topic today is imposter syndrome. It's something that I'll be the first to say I know a number of people have suffered from and can relate to, including myself on 1 or 2 occasions throughout my career, that's for sure. So with that, we're going to present some slides. You'll be pleased to know there are 5, 6 slides in totality, so it's not going to be, straight back into the new year with a big deck of slides. And with that, I'm going to hand over to yourself, Claire, and then start the screen sharing.
Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for inviting me to talk about imposter syndrome. I should say that I gave John a number of topics, and it's interesting that he chose imposter syndrome. So you might want to ask him why he picked on that one. And I think it's probably because he's heard the term used so much and heard people suffer from it. And I'd like to pick up one thing right at the beginning. As Ollie said, he knows a number of people who suffer from it. I think the language we use in everyday speech becomes a habit, and suffer from already begs the question. Do we have to say suffer from, or shall we say something that people experience? So we're already reframing and changing our track. So let's first of all define our terms. And before I do so, I want to say why this is so interesting to me. I run and set up a business 20 years ago called Integrated Resources. Officially, I suppose we would call ourselves an HR consultancy, but we actually make organizations work better, either from an employment law aspect in its various guises, something as small as putting in an appraisal scheme, making sure it's lawful, running a grievance, doing a handbook, to bigger things like mergers, acquisitions, and restructuring. But the other side of our work, as it divides roughly into 2, is about releasing potential. And that is what fascinates me. And that, for me, is what our business is really about. It's about releasing potential. And the imposter syndrome, or the imposter phenomenon, as I'm going to try and call it, but of course we're habituated to call it the imposter syndrome, gets in the way of releasing potential. Thanks, Ollie, for dealing with the slides. Could you take me to the first one, please? So here we have a spotty dog. We've all watched 101 Dalmatians, but this spotty dog is suffering from imposter syndrome. He's done a bit of therapy, so he's feeling a bit better. And he feels that he doesn't deserve to be amidst all these thoroughbred Dalmatians. So what is imposter syndrome? Because the term is bandied around all over the place. And the DSM, which, as you know, is the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Health Disorders, does not recognize it. It is actually a phenomenon. And I think that's the first thing to think about. If you feel you are challenged by imposter syndrome, it is not an illness. It is a syndrome. It is a combination of feelings, thoughts, and responses to the various stimuli we receive. I'll go on to explain more about what I mean. KPMG did a survey in October 2020, and they said that 75% of women suffer from imposter syndrome. Now, most of us don't like particularly talking about our vulnerabilities, but this perhaps is one that we should talk about. So I decided to get on the phone to a few people, and I rang an experienced psychoanalyst, and she says, imposter syndrome doesn't exist, and then laughed and said, by that I mean, there is no such defined syndrome. It's a term used, and this is where I'm going to go for my definition, to describe a variety of feelings and behaviors and emotions. And it's okay to have negative feelings and emotions in any sphere. It only begins to matter when it gets out of hand. She also said to me, of course, more women suffer from it. When she said, of course, I raised an eyebrow. I think just as many men suffer from it, but there are reasons why more women should suffer from it, and I'll explain. So, in a few words, it's an acute self-doubt about success, and it causes suffering. And I thought it was good to look at it and also to think about what we might do about it to make life better for those who are impeded by it, who are even disabled by it. So I would say that we all suffer from imposter syndrome at some stage to some greater or lesser extent. And it doesn't matter except where it becomes too much. But it's not a mental disorder. I'm not going to go and get the men in white coats. And it is a reaction to the things that we're experiencing. And we can only gauge within our own heads personally what is affecting our ability to function. So if imposter syndrome is affecting your ability to function and to perform to the level that you are able potentially, then it becomes a problem. Now, if we can move on to the next slide, please, Ollie, and the one beyond it. We have here a spectrum, and on the left-hand side, we have psychoanalysis. And at the far right, we have training. And you will note that as we move through this spectrum, these are all interventions that can be done in order to bring about behavioral change. We're all familiar with training. Everybody uses coaching and mentoring in the same breath. They are not the same thing. The coach is the facilitator, the vehicle through which an individual gets from A to B. And you are often, as a coach, I find, helping people not just to find where B is, that they're going, but also where A is, where they're coming from. Mentoring is more technical, so I wouldn't mentor unless I was mentoring an HR director, human resources director, because that's my area of expertise, or perhaps actually the piano. So at the other end of the spectrum, we have non-prescriptive areas. Coaching can be prescriptive, but it might not be. Mentoring tends to be more prescriptive. Training is prescriptive. It's transferring skills, knowledge, and attributes. In psychoanalysis, and I think there's a lot misunderstood about psychoanalysis, it is that the psychoanalyst is a vehicle for helping you analyze various behaviors and responses and try to find out where they may be coming from, where in the unconscious they lie. The unconscious is unconscious, so we cannot access it. So this is a vehicle to look through talking therapy at why something may be the case. I think we have a psychotherapist on the call. I'm certainly expecting one. And she might be able to answer for a group of psychotherapists, but there are different schools of psychotherapy. And the psychotherapist, the word therapy is in there from the Greek therapevo, to heal. So there is a healing element. There is a need. An individual is helped to respond to certain difficult challenges that has brought them there. Counselling is used very loosely. Some therapists might say they fall into a bigger category of counsellors. Some counsellors would say they're not psychotherapists because they're not psychotherapeutically trained. All I would say is whichever part of intervention you feel you would like to bring about, you have to find one that works for you. I sit very much in the coaching, mentoring sphere, but I did do 8 years of psychoanalysis because I became extraordinarily fascinated about what it could do to help release potential. So I will use a variety of techniques, and sometimes I will borrow something from psychoanalysis along the line. Now, please don't worry about yourselves. I don't know whether you've ever read Three Men in a Boat, but at the beginning, the author says, I even began to think I was suffering from housemaid's knee, which is what maids used to suffer from when they were scrubbing steps in the Victorian era and before. And the author is male, and he's saying that if you start reading about ailments, you will start thinking you suffer from it. So just bear that in mind. And if you do sometimes feel a bit of an imposter, you feel that you shouldn't be there, that you didn't deserve the job, that you don't deserve the rewards you're getting, that you're a fraud, that you're going to get found out, It doesn't matter unless it starts taking you over. And if it stops you being the best you want it to be. And whether I use the term imposter phenomenon or imposter syndrome in coaching, I find that a lot of people exhibit traits that demonstrate this does haunt them. The other thing to think about is that everything that is a crisis exacerbates the way you feel. So, lockdown is often making the imposter phenomenon more common. People have a lot of time alone. And women, particularly at the moment, I've noticed this experientially, are feeling it even more because they feel they're failing as educators because that is not what they're trained to do. And my EA said to me earlier today, the trouble is, she said, I don't feel I can do anything well because I'm having to educate the children and do my work. So, what is it? It's a pattern of behavior. It afflicts not those who are failing, but those who are successful. They doubt their abilities. They have a persistent and acute fear of being exposed. It is debilitating at its worst. Now, we all have fears, and I would say that KPMG is wrong saying that 70% of women suffer from imposter syndrome at some time. I would say that everybody suffers from imposter syndrome. There is always a voice that sometimes and only occasionally sits on our shoulders and says, ha ha, one day they'll find you out. There was a tweet recently on @womeninmedchat. It was very interesting. A lot of doctors were saying that they attributed their success and their accomplishments to good luck or to good timing. And I remember a year I was seconded to the Oxford Career Service from ICI in its heyday, the forerunner of AstraZeneca. And the principal of Somerville College, Oxford, Daphne Park, who'd been in MI6, said that women don't get the top jobs because they don't apply for them. And I would suggest that imposter syndrome contributes to that. And for the Greek on the team, you on the call today, I noticed we saw one at least. The ancient Greeks used to say "miden agan," nothing in excess. And again, this applies universally to everything. Wonderful phrase, nothing in excess. So if you've got a bit of imposter syndrome, fine. It might keep you on your toes. It might help you perform better. It's excess that is the ruination. I don't want to go into a gender debate, but I see in every bit of coaching I do, whether I'm coaching Adam Brooks consultants for big leadership posts or a sales manager for the whole of the UK, there are moments when they doubt themselves. But there are different social and political and economic influences on women and the way we receive them from those received by men. Likewise, we see different generations. And although we have an Equality Act with 9 protected characteristics, including gender and age, there are differences between ages because of the social and political and economic influences that they face. Why should women face more imposter syndrome? Well, it was only in 1882, in the Married Women's Property Act, that women were allowed to own property after they married. In the greater scheme of things, that's not that long ago. Until the war, married women had to resign from jobs on marrying. It was only during the second part of the war, where all the men were fighting the war, that women were needed in factories and offices where in posts previously held by men. And it wasn't until 1978 that the Employment Protection Act came in, which allowed women to return to work having had a child. It's not that long ago. So the speed with which women have had to develop their skills, talents, and release their potential has been much shorter, and the exponential growth has been much faster. So there is bound to be more of a tendency to feel a fraud. So imposter syndrome, okay, if it's something that hits all of us at some time, why bother with it? Well, again, only if it's acute do you really need to do something. But if it is growing and it really is blocking your potential, then there is a chance that you will later develop depression or anxiety or a lot of symptoms of stress. And it was this that made the psychoanalyst I phoned say what she said about women. So, interestingly, the imposter phenomenon became known in a paper by Clance and Imes in 1978. I don't think it's coincidence that that is the year at which employment protection came in the UK. And factors in this paper are clear. They include gender stereotypes, early family dynamics, and culture and style. Now, we've all done different interventions at different times of our lives. Some people do meditation, some do yoga, some become Buddhist, some do psychoanalysis, some go for psychotherapy. But there are a whole number of things we can do to change the way we feel. And I happen to be very pro psychoanalysis, but that's because I spent 8 years doing it and I thought it was very valuable. But we all experience different things as children. And I don't know about your children, but my children come from certainly different planets. And each child picks up different stimulations in different ways and therefore manifests different challenges. But imposter phenomenon can bring symptoms related to depression. And it doesn't just happen in high achieving women. In the Twitter I mentioned earlier, which was a female Twitter dominantly, one man says, "I was the third best student in my year. I'm top of the tree. I'm the best in the world at what I do. And 30 years later, I still suffer from imposter phenomenon. But I absolutely refuse to let it interfere with my objectives or my goals." And I think there is a clue there in what needs to be done about it. So, do you have, I'm not going to ask anybody and put them on the spot, you can ask this for yourself. Do you have feelings and beliefs that limit your ability to achieve? And what do you want to achieve? And it was Socrates through the mouth of Plato that says the examined life is not worth living. And possibly the intervention of counseling, psychotherapy, coaching, psychoanalysis can really help you release your potential. The thing is, who do you go to? Well, obviously, I'm very keen on coaching, and there is nothing as wonderful as seeing people being able to release themselves for what has held them back. There are directories, the BACP and the UKCP has directories of accredited psychotherapists, and there are sources of psychoanalysis which I'm happy to pass on to anybody who wants some intervention or for somebody else. So, are you feeling inordinately fearful? Ollie, could you please give me the next slide? So this will load up automatically. I've got a wonderful data scientist. We have here 8 segments of life, and you can cut these segments any which way. But in most coaching manuals and courses, you will see that the life is divided into these 8 segments. And you know, we spend a lot of time in work, and nobody ever went to the pearly gates and says to St. Peter, "I wish I'd spent more time in the office." There are the rest of parts of our life. So, are you limiting yourself in any particular part of your life? And I find I do an awful lot of work in coaching, helping people look at every single section of their life to make it better so they are less fearful. And the first thing to do is to access your desire. Now, isn't that easy? We all know what we want. Actually, human beings find it very hard to access their desire. So the first thing to think about is, what do you want to achieve in each of those segments? Can you actually write your goals? Accessing desire is very complex. And if you do decide you want to embark on a big commitment, and psychoanalysis is, then I thoroughly recommend it. But it's an enormous commitment, and it was curiosity that drove me there. I think you need a big question that is sitting in your mind. And because I'm particularly interested in releasing potential, this has been a good area for me. I grew up in a vicarage in industrial Manchester, and I saw people coming in and out of the house for the whole of my childhood, and I got fascinated by why some people behaved in one way and another set of people behaved in another. So for me, that's what human resources consultants is about, even in the application of employment law, which is probably 50% of our work. So are you nervous? Are you anxious? Are you fearful? Is this stopping you achieve? Do you feel a bit of a fraud? And how can you seek an intervention? Well, there's always medication, but medication's no good without talking therapy. You're all familiar with mental disorders, sadly. We hear about them all the time: depression, bipolarity, eating disorders, to mention just a couple of the 7 types. But imposter syndrome is not mentioned. So it's very personal. What do you want to do about it? How comfortable are you? Where do you think you want to go to get something done about it? Um, So, what sort of things do we see people saying in their heads? There is the need to be the best. I want to be the best. I always want to be the best. I'm terrified of failure. I really don't think I've got the ability. I feel guilty that I've been so successful. And the effect on other people in the workplace when it's acute can be devastating. Imposter phenomenon people tend to micromanage. They're very slow to make decisions because they want it to be perfect. They constantly need to be perfect, so they're quite tormented. They work excessively and they work compulsively. It's very difficult for the mere mortals around them to cope. So if most of us experience some imposter syndrome, what's the test for doing anything about it that you feel thoroughly uncomfortable? But there's also the question of, why am I like that? And if you listen to people and the language they use, language is terribly, terribly important. It is really the mirror of our soul. And it's worth listening to our own language and the language of other people. Sometimes the imposter syndrome, the imposter phenomenon, can be very irritating to the person who says, "Oh, no, I'm not very good at this. Oh, that's a lovely dress you're wearing. Oh, well, I got it in a charity shop." It can be very disconcerting for the other person who, for example, pays a compliment, and it cannot be assertively accepted. Even in our own team, I recruited somebody some months ago, and she stayed with us a week. We've never had this happen before. And I asked for a copy of her psychometric profile, as she had been using the same tool that I use. And I didn't see it for 5 days of her working with us. And when I saw it, I could see the problems she displayed. And she said to me after 5 days, "I suffer from depression. I have severe imposter syndrome. I don't like my work being checked." And my heart sank. I knew then the writing was on the wall, because in consultancy, you have to always check each other's work before it goes to the client. That's normal and best practice. So we can do some things about it, because I looked at her psychometric profile 5 days in. And normally we run the profile beforehand, and I will run the profile. But this individual had already done it, so she didn't give it to me, which was interesting in itself. And there are clues in certain psychometrics. I'll come back to that. Are we encouraging our children towards imposter syndrome? Are we too protective? That can have effect. Are we too critical? That can have too much of an effect. So again, it's back to this: me, then again, nothing in excess. Family labels can be deadly. Oh, he's the good looking one. Oh, she's the clever one. Oh, she's the slow one. And children hear these things. Labels are an interesting topic in themselves. Sometimes people like them. They think it lets them off the hook. I'm on this spectrum. I suffer from that. It doesn't actually let you off the hook. And above all, everything that we do in bringing up our children and in the workplace. And in the workplace, always in the workplace, self-worth is critical. And do we always give people their self-worth? So there are a number of external exercises you can do if you feel you're suffering from imposter phenomenon. One is to work out what you want, to write your objectives, to write out your life objectives. I have some great techniques for doing that. We don't start off in a journey in the car to go somewhere, unless it's Barnard Castle, if we don't know where it is we're going. We know where we're starting from and where we're going. And the biggest journey we do, life, we don't have a destination. So what are our objectives? What is the trick to looking back at, say, age 90 and saying, I don't regret doing this, rather because I've done it, but rather than, oh, I wish I had. And I think if you're listening to language, that expression, I wish I had said, I wish I'd done, these are the keys to somebody's difficult experiences. Write out your objectives, reframe your ideas. Instead of saying, I cannot, think about what you can. Accept compliments, that is the assertive response. Thank you is the assertive response. Be a champion for people who are suffering from imposter syndrome. It may affect you at some time. Put together a small self-help group. The word I use most in any coaching experience is the word boundaries. Boundaries, boundaries, boundaries. If people transgress your boundaries or you transgress theirs, we need mechanisms for doing that. People talk about assertive training. I try to think about assertiveness much more as a win-win. I wish I'd said, listen to the language triggers. And I use something called non-violent communication, which I'll happily tell you about afterwards if you have questions on that, as a technique for dealing with assertiveness, which you can actually learn to try and help yourself from the outside in. Sharing is very important. If you can bring yourself to share your imposter feelings, then that brings a normalization. You begin to feel normal. There are great achievers in all sorts of spheres who suffer from the imposter phenomenon. Tom Hanks has commented on it, David Tennant has, Michelle Obama has. And it's quite nice thinking about what you think could be the opposite of imposter syndrome. This game doesn't quite work exactly, but I always think that narcissism is the opposite of the imposter syndrome. The narcissist thinks he's great at everything. I have in my mind, of course, at the moment, Donald Trump. And if you read the book that's been written by his niece, who is a psychotherapist, you can actually answer some of the questions about why he is like he is. Some people recommend group therapy for the imposter phenomenon. I can think of nothing worse, but that's a very personal opinion. It takes huge courage to share things in a group. And I think if you're an imposter, it would be even harder to share that in a group. But it does make you feel more normal. So it might be better having a small group of friends that you talk to about it. But it's fantastic to be able to own it and feel much better. So how do I know when I'm dealing somebody with imposter syndrome? And it was very interesting. I was on the phone to a client the other day. He was asking a question about a disciplinary matter. And I said, do you want to come to this talk on imposter syndrome on Thursday? Oh, you mean about people covering up their mistakes? And I thought, he doesn't know what imposter syndrome is. So it's not going to go very well for his organization when somebody is suffering from imposter syndrome. It's not about covering your mistakes. It often happens to high achievers. It's about fundamental self-worth. Some parents give their children messages of superiority. Some give their children messages of inferiority. Anything in excess produces an outcome. And if you start saying, I feel like a fake, I feel like a failure, there's something going on. So what do? We acknowledge it, We use a variety of techniques, from psychoanalysis through NLP, through coaching to training. We talk about it. We consider the wheel of life. We look at the context of where the imposter syndrome is taking us and where it hits us. And we reframe what we're thinking with language. Failure is a huge opportunity. It's an opportunity to learn. Having some imposter syndrome, some phenomenon, gives you an excuse to examine what's going on. That can be rewarding. If you do suffer from imposter syndrome, give yourself some rewards. Consciously diarize some rewards. And remember Stephen Covey's second habit of the 7 habits of highly effective people. Remember to start off by knowing what your outcome is. Don't pick up the phone, don't have a conversation, don't go into a meeting without knowing what your outcome is. I think it's the single most important of Stephen Covey's 7 habits. You can learn a lot about imposter syndrome by looking at the titles of the books about it. One's called Saying No, one's called Trusting Your Instinct, one's called Boundaries, one's called Self-Authenticity. And those with imposter phenomenon can be difficult to deal with because they are often successful and yet they speak down their achievements. What is clear, though, is that if you are suffering rather than experiencing something, it's time to do something. Psychoanalysis and psychotherapy is still seen in the UK as for those who are a bit nutty. It certainly isn't. And it's fine if you have an occasional feeling of being a fraud. If it's finite, it's fine. If it's infinite, it isn't. The sense of being a fraud, the sense of being discovered, the difficulty of releasing your potential. Do you always turn into a frightened rabbit? Does it affect your job performance? Does it stop you and distract you from applying for that job that you actually do want and can want? So what should we do? We should celebrate. Celebrate our own achievements personally. Write down achievements. Think I, not we, own your success. Focus on your future goals, your life goals, and make sure they're realistic, because if you set yourself up for failure by making them a fantasy, you will fail, and that will feed the imposter syndrome. But if you don't act, you could make yourself ill. I thoroughly recommend the use of a particular psychometric tool, Luminous Spark, which is built on the main building blocks of many psychometrics. And this tool enables you to look at the underlying, the everyday, and the overextended personas. That is to say, the person you really are underlying, what you demonstrate as a person in the workplace, and what happens when you're under pressure and under stress. You become what is called overextended. And looking at whether those 3 personas sit far apart is very interesting, because the chances are that you will be suffering in some way from imposter syndrome. So we have the expert. He needs to know every bit of information, or she, before they can move. The perfectionist is constantly seeking perfection. The soloist turns down help in order to prove his own self-worth. The superhero slogs his guts out and gets burnout. These are all things that if you're using the right kind of tools, you can see it. So you could use psychometrics in recruitment and in promotion. The risk factors are new circumstances, a particular time of stress. We're all under stress at the moment. New family, changes in family, being in a minority group, other mental health issues, and the use of certain language. And because of the comment I heard from the client this week, I must differentiate absolutely between the imposter phenomenon, or the imposter syndrome, and the imposter. Some of you will have seen the film The Talented Mr. Ripley. Mr. Ripley takes on somebody's identity, becomes addicted to the idea of being in somebody else's identity, and then keeps perpetuating it. His motive is probably that he is lying in order to obtain fundamental love from other people. And then the individual begins to believe the lie, and basically it's a swindle. That is not imposter syndrome. That is being an imposter. Mr. Ripley breaks all social elevated circles and breaks in very successfully, and starts by chance because he borrows a Princeton jacket and rather likes the role this gives him. And in one of these, and it's not often in a film that the individual carries it off completely successfully. He doesn't get found out. The imposter is usually a narcissist. The imposter syndrome holder is not usually a narcissist. So let's have a think about what we can do, and I will summarize and stop. If you are suffering in this kind of way and experiencing too much imposter phenomenon, normalize it, share it. Remember, there are famous people who suffer and experience life as you do. No one is perfect. Challenge the negative tapes in your head. Turn them around and make them positive. Challenge your thought about feeling you have imposter syndrome. What do you mean by that? Use affirmations to tell yourself that you do have positive strengths and you're there because you deserve to be. If you don't, then the credit you deserve becomes shame. You can become too afraid to succeed, and then you certainly need some intervention. And if you want to read some more about it, I would recommend a paper that Freud wrote in 1916, which is very interesting. If you want help, you want names of suitable therapists, coaches, mentors, and so forth, I'm happy to pass on some names individually. And if you want to read another survey, Advancing the Future of Women in Business, that KPMG wrote last year, that's worth reading. Having a coach or a mentor can be very, very effective. And remember that it's the successful who tend to have these feelings of inadequacy. Reframe. If you find yourself saying one thing, reframe it. I got here because I'm liked. No, I got here because of my abilities. As someone's going to find me out, I'm not worthy. The positive frame is, I'm doing my very best. I got here because I'm lucky. No, I make mistakes and I learn from them. I don't have the skills to do X and Y. Think about the skills you do have. I do have the skills and I bring this to the team. So let's not diminish the experience of others. And I'll leave you with a quote from Leonard Cohen that I saw, which I thought described what I was trying to say. Ring the bells that can still ring. Forget the perfect offering. There is a crack in everything. Let the light get in. Thank you for your time. Was that okay? Do you think they'll find me out? Thank you.
That's awesome. Thank you, Claire. There was an awful lot to take on board there. So I'm just going to let that permeate for a minute or two. But also, does anybody have any questions that they'd like to ask?
Could you put the last slide on for me, Ollie?
Yeah, of course, absolutely. Yeah, does anybody have any questions? Does anybody want to talk about any experiences? I'm going to give that the 5-second Zoom rule. Nobody's come off of mute yet. Been there myself. So if no one else is going to do this, I'm going to dive straight in the deep end. I've been there myself. It took 3.5 years to become part of what was considered to be an inner team of technologists inside an organization. 3.5 years. You got into that organization not through doing any of your work. You were paid to do that. You were expected to do that. It was the stuff you did outside of work that became relevant. So the things outside of your day job. The subsequent process of that is that you walk into a room full of highly talented individuals that are making key decisions about business direction and various other things. And it became very obvious very quick that you're the new guy in the room, and the spotlight's on you to deliver straight away. And actually that was a very interesting process. But what came off the back of that, though, is number one is you didn't get that period to settle in. You were expected to deliver instant results. But the other bit was that when I spoke to other members, they went through exactly the same process, which was as soon as you'd got the role, you'd been accredited into that position, you forgot just to be yourself. And I think that was part of the challenge, was all of a sudden, it's because the light was on you so much that you felt as though you weren't delivering through your normal natural abilities. Does that make sense? Like you had to tap into something that you'd previously never exhibited.
Yeah, I think it says something about, I regard induction and retention as a follow on from the recruitment process. And I think the organization is missing a trick in the way it onboards people. And I think when you start a new job, there are two contracts. There's the employment contract, and there's also the psychological contract. And the employer does the first bit to varying good degrees, and fails to do the second bit. So I think a lot of that onus, unfortunately, lay with somebody else, and you were the victim of it. And I think listening to you talk about it, you've managed to distance yourself from it, and you describe it using the word you, meaning one, the general you all. But it's actually about you. And I think you found a coping mechanism. You've kind of distanced yourself from it. And that worked clearly, because here you are doing all sorts of great things.
For sure. I think as well, though, it was a lot of these things are personal, as you say, it's baggage, it's personal baggage that you assume that you should have. I remember my boss turned around to me on one occasion and said, okay, you've delivered against what you needed to do, but now, like a rock band, you've delivered the first killer album. Let's not let the second album drop. And the problem is that then, again, the pressure, we all put pressure on ourselves to exceed and to excel. Do you see that in people that exhibit imposter syndrome? They're their own worst critic most of the time, right?
I think it's a matter of degree. So today, did I feel a little nervous? Yes, because I haven't spoken through the chamber before. Am I used to speaking? Yes. I felt nervous. Do I feel an imposter? Absolutely not, because I really know this subject well, and I can cite lots of anecdotes. If I'm playing a concert, a recital with the piano, I'm petrified always, whatever the venue, however many hundreds of people are there. But I don't feel an imposter. So I think there is a huge degree of difference between constantly feeling you're a fraud and being too frightened to apply for that job, too frightened to put your hand up, too frightened to take on a project that really you'd be fantastic at. I think there's a difference. I think fear, nervousness, I remember described by a cellist to a group of pianists last year. He said, you should welcome it because it's your helper. It helps you to perform. So fear is effective, but not too much of it. I just finished a book by Victoria Hislop called Those Who Are Loved, about Nazi Germany and the German occupation of Greece. You can tell I'm very interested in Greece, and the aftermath and the rise of the colonels and the fall of the colonels. And the thing that you feel several times in the book is this extraordinary fear beyond fear that is too much. So it's all about moderation, about me then I am, nothing in excess.
Yeah, for sure. And actually, in relation to your point around stress and fear, it is absolutely something you can call on. So having done a lot of public speaking, walking into a new environment in front of 500 people is not something that I didn't find intimidating. Absolutely, every time I did it. But the point being is that that rush of chemicals around your body, when you frame it to your own mind that actually you need these right now to perform to the best of your ability, in the same way as you would do with fight or flight, right? Then all of a sudden you start to frame it to yourself, and you start to become comfortable in that space. And that's that's part of the challenge, isn't it? To become comfortable outside of what you would consider to be your comfort zone, and to embrace it rather than push back at it. I think that's
You see, I don't think you suffer from imposter syndrome. You'll be very relieved to know that, because you put your hand up, you do that, you're able to do that, you can apply
now,
that job.
but that's after 7 or 8 years of having to deal with it on a daily basis, right?
So you've found a way of dealing with it, but
For
now I don't think you're suffering from it. Only you know, though, because of course we all see the world through our own heads. Yeah.
Yeah, I guess I very much live in a world that unless I'm suffering some sort of stress or fear or worry or anxiety, then I'm not pushing myself. So I'm in a comfort zone. Does anybody else have anything to add
Yeah,
around this?
there's a question that's come up. It's a great question. Would you say sometimes culture, race contribute to the imposter syndrome? Absolutely, I would. I think that, as I said, there are 9 protected characteristics in the Equality Act, and one of them is gender, one of them is age, one of them is ethnicity, one of them is marital status, pregnancy. All these stages and parts of life affect the way other people treat us. So it can. And I think we don't always know the damage we're doing, and it's often through language. So, yes, I would say it contributes to the imposter syndrome. Not always, but often. Does that answer your question?
For sure. And for anybody on the call, I mean, what's the first step to this? Is it to recognize the symptoms and to reach out?
I think, I mean, you should ask a therapist on the call, but I think the first thing is always to acknowledge there's a problem. It's no different from alcoholism. The alcoholic usually says, "Oh, I drink a lot, I'm not an alcoholic." And the first step is to say, "I've got a drink problem." And that is a huge, big step. Then, at least once you've admitted to yourself there's a drink problem, then you're admitting it's a problem. And then you might think about solving it. So the first thing is to say, "Hey, this has got out of hand. I really need to do something, because I know in my heart, in my gut, that I am not reaching to the stars in the way that I know I'm capable of, but this is getting in the way all the time." And the woman I was referring to, I took on a few months ago, who suffers from depression and imposter syndrome and didn't like her work being checked, actually has huge ability. And I was very saddened by her decision after a few days that she would leave. But she just couldn't release her potential and actually needed some help. She was a very smart woman. So it's from where I sit, when I see ability that isn't being released, I think it's a tragedy.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. But I think as well, and you raise a great point here, which is that I've known quite a few business leaders, different sizes of the business, and actually the same thing comes across every single time, that these people have learned to deal with situations like this, and they're reoccurring as well. You know, just because you think you have a handle of a scenario today, you get dropped into another scenario, and a new set of challenges appear, right? So it's a management program, if nothing else, right? I
Mm.
think there are some messages in there. There are various things happening from a society perspective over the last 3-4 years. The BLM process, women in technology, these are all things that I've been part of in various other organizations. And so there are a huge amount of factors that contribute to how something is received by an individual. And I'd be the first to say, as a society, we've got a lot to learn at the moment. And I think there's a lot of voices in the room to try and get to the bottom of some of those problems.
Yes, somebody's asked another interesting question, Heidi. When you discuss normalizing the topic of imposter syndrome, how do you raise this within a work scenario? Well, it depends on the scenario and the people involved, and whether, I mean, we're consultants, so we come in and sort something out. So it will often raise itself. We're dealing with an extremely complex grievance at the moment with an individual who personally, I think, suffering from acute depression, and has terribly severe imposter feelings. Um, but it isn't our role to raise that, because we are having to deal with a statutory process and a grievance procedure. And we've been engaged to do a certain job, so we're doing it. If this individual talked to me quietly and said, I'm really suffering, I need some help, then I would intervene and discuss it and suggest some mechanisms. So it depends really whether this is raised. And somebody else is saying, would you also say that some bosses do play on that when they realize an employee is infected by an imposter syndrome? Yes, you get good managers and bad managers. You get great leaders and shocking leaders. Imposter syndrome stemming from childhood past? Possibly, yes, but also it can come through other stimuli as you grow older. You can develop it within a couple, with somebody having a deleterious effect on somebody. So it might come later.
There's another question in the chat as well, which is, socioeconomic issues as well. When you look at your background and also growing up, opportunities open to you as the individual. And sometimes that, as a result of that, it feels like it's harder to climb a career ladder. We put a lot of focus on education, right?
We do. I mean, I often think about what Daphne Park said at Somerville. So what year was that? Well, 1984. That would have been 87. And she had been unusual, and she'd been a phenomenally successful woman in MI6 in an era when women weren't doing those kind of roles. And she said, as I mentioned earlier, women don't get the top jobs because they don't apply. That may be being driven by imposter syndrome, it may be being driven by something else, but there's certainly an issue of self-worth in there. So if I were to leave 3 words behind with you today, I would leave boundaries and self-worth.
Perfect. Does anybody else have any other questions they'd like to ask? I know we've got 3 or 4 more minutes left of Claire's time.
Could I just come in and just to ask Claire, because obviously we've been going through a kind of world that we've never lived in before, and people have really found it difficult to cope with COVID. And one of the challenges that we see is that people that are able to succeed and are extremely good at what they do and how they do it have suddenly found they're not able to through circumstances rather than their own inability. And that this is kind of creating the doubt in their minds in relation to the fact that they're actually not able to perform anymore.
I think it is a very difficult time, and what strikes me very forcibly is that here we are for the first time ever in the UK in a pandemic situation. In 1918, with the flu epidemic, which killed more people than would die if everybody in the world globally now got COVID. So let's put that in proportion for a moment. And that's partly, we know that because of social media and news and media in general. So we are facing something absolutely novel. What strikes me is how incredibly flexible we've been, because we've been faced with all this novelty, horrible novelty, and we've coped with it. Isn't that amazing? So that's demonstrated something to me about humanity, that it has a resilience and flexibility we don't give ourselves credit for. But it also depends on your nature. And some people are this and some people are that. And, the psychometric tool I use looks at 144 characteristics. It's a lot of characteristics. I love home working. We have always worked 60% of our time. We're a team of 11. We've always worked 60% remotely. It's not been a big deal for us. But my children are grown up, and I am only too well aware. I'm a governor at the University of Cambridge Primary School. I am very well aware how incredibly difficult it is for people who are living in small apartments, small houses with children without enough space. And they are managing as best they can. It is bound to have some long-term damage, and I dread to think of the damage it's having on teenagers.
Yeah, for sure. I think as well, some of that, you know, teenagers have always been quite good at communicating remotely with technology, but at the same time as well, it's certainly damaging with regards to skills in the workplace and various other processes like that. And at the moment as well, access is particularly hard again. So there are a number of challenges. We touched on this previously, and things like the Kickstarter were set up to try and help get the younger generation into the workplace. But John, you're entirely right. I mean, I've got a friend that lives in an apartment in London, and the top floor of a townhouse has nothing but 5 rooms to ping around in, as he puts it, all day long. And that's the entirety of his existence during lockdown, other than go to the shops. It's a pretty lonely place to exist, right?
Yeah, and people have different boundaries about being lonely and what they need from other people. You know, you could argue that the extrovert is going to be very miserable in lockdown. I'm an extrovert. I'm not miserable in lockdown, but I've got a brilliant bubble. So, in fact, my bubble's online here today. And so that's made a big difference for me. So we can look at our natures and see what we can do to deal with the negatives, but lack of physical space is very, very tricky. And a lack of being able to plan is pretty devastating. But as John said at the beginning, the end is coming. Whereas before, we didn't even know where the middle was. So things are getting better. So again, reframing it, there is an end, and it is coming. It may not be soon enough. Isn't soon enough for me, isn't soon enough for John, it probably isn't soon enough for you, but it is coming.
And to double down on that point, we're at 5:01. The end is definitely coming.
And if anybody wants to talk to me, you've got my details there. I'm happy to, whether it's employment law or whether it's the imposter phenomenon or whether it's how they're being shafted at work. I'm happy to talk about anything. I see it every day.
That's perfect. And we can make sure they're circulated around to everybody afterwards with the recording. So yeah, I'd just like to say thank you very much indeed, Claire. Thank you for your time. I found that very interesting.
Yeah, thanks from me as well, Claire. Very much appreciate it.
Thank you. I enjoyed doing it very much. Thank you for bringing me.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Now, have a good day.
Take care,
Thank
everyone.
you. Goodbye.
Take care.
Bye-bye.
Bye.